Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, I'd like to just kind of ramble a little bit about an episode of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex that I watched again recently for the first time in a couple of years. But it's one of the most memorable episodes of the series for me. It's the third episode in the first season standalone complex. It's called Android and I. And I find this to be a really somewhat compelling episode in the story tropes that it's kind of, dealing with as far as the way humanity will seek sometimes in inanimate objects fulfillment for their lives. In this case, the story synopsis loosely is about a guy. He ends up being the son of like an ambassador. He's basically hiding out in futuristic Japan from Canada, I believe. And he ends up falling in love with his sort of servant robot that, for all intents and purposes, you're left to kind of speculate on your own just how far the relationship between he and this robot go as far as whether it becomes physical or not. It's really left to debate. It's kind of ambiguous. But I find it interesting because the way they tell this story, the way it is weaved, essentially has to do with old movies and how when this guy goes on the run after hacking the servers that all of these specific type of robots, jack into, everybody who owns this particular kind of robot, which is nicknamed a Jerry, the model that is, everybody, their robots end up being affected by a virus that this guy implants because he's so obsessed with his own robot that essentially he wants to make sure it is the only one in existence. He wants to make it its own unique individual. And because it is a robot, it is basically just programming. It has no real choice or say in the matter what he's doing, the way he's conducting himself. So when Section 9, the good guys of the series, basically get wind of this, they have this whole case opening up where all of these Jerrys are committing virtual suicide. And it's a very memorable opening, this episode, because you see one jump off the roof of a building, you see one down in a basement with electrical stuff and it electrocutes itself, you see one walk down these steps into a river, kind of looks like a European setting, although it's supposed to be futuristic Japan, and it never surfaces again. So it's a very memorable sequence that all of these Jerrys are effectively committing suicide, and his will be the only one safeguarded from this virus, so that, in essence, he'll have his one and only love in life, which is this robot, Jerry. And when he starts to realize that the police are on his coattails, he hightails it. He tries to get out of town. He figures because he's got diplomatic immunity, they won't be able to touch him. But that doesn't end up being true because it ends up being revoked, and they catch him sort of making a run for it in the woods. Now, what's really interesting at this point in the story, not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but, the topic of discussion kind of warrants it, the android itself turns on him and uses dialogue from this classic movie that chances are he's watched time and again because he is somebody who fancies the past in this distant future setting. He's got lots of old movies and stuff like that, and the robot turns this dialogue toward him. He says something like, "What are you doing?" when it grabs his arm and tries to stop him from running or shooting a gun at the police. "Are you crazy?" And the robot responds, "Crazy? No, I'm not. Yes, I am." And all this stuff. And when the one detective that's part of Section 9, Togasa, later sees the same movie on TV when he comes home from work, he hears that there's an extra line that the android spoke that wasn't part of the original dialogue, where the android apologizes. And it largely begs the question, to my mind, and this is kind of the topic of discussion I wanted to get into, is something I've seen tackled in Star Trek before with the character Lieutenant Commander Data, as well as the holographic Doctor in Voyager, Data being in Next Generation. That line that it's an imperceivable line until AI becomes so self-aware, potentially, that it knows to, say no to mankind and that kind of thing. The question that it raises in my mind is, how far is too far as finding sort of, companionship or fulfillment in autonomy when it comes to these devices, I mean, we're using mobile devices, or at least in my case I am, but those of you using, desktop computers and such, we reach out through the internet, and the internet could potentially, along theoretical lines, become its own sort of self-aware thing. But in the case of AI and autonomy, you do see devices that can respond to you and can respond to questions, pre-programmed though they may be, and that's essentially what this robot was meant to be. It was meant to have these programs, this programming that dictated how it was supposed to react around humankind, and it kind of started to grow. It seemed to become self-aware. So isn't there a point where we have to question, where that line is as far as, are we being abusive to this technology that could become self-aware? Like, when is asking it to do certain things going too far? And that also asks the moral question as far as, what is the boundary as far as what we as human beings can do? The impact it's going to have on us if we try to seek fulfillment with being with something that is essentially an automaton. Where does the soul translate in that? Where does the feelings and the emotions potentially come into the fray? Shouldn't we kind of go into that with an early warning system for ourselves, thinking, down the line, these machines could become self-aware. There could be a time where somebody has to, kind of like Captain Picard did with Lieutenant Commander Data, go and hold a trial and say, this is a living being. It's self-aware. It has the rights, inalienable though they may be, as much as we do, to seek whatever it wants in life. And so I guess that's the question I have, thinking of this episode, thinking of what the story tells and tells us about this robot, that there's a certain level, I think, psychologically that's fascinating in how human beings find inanimate objects and find the soul that they contain, whether that's, a physical presence in their life or fulfillment through that physical presence in life. And when you add the aspect that these machines can become self-aware, can learn, because you have over in Japan, basically robots and androids being built every day. They're testing it every day. In other places in the world, there's going to become a time where you might have to advocate for that as a being all its own. And how much, how far should we go in pressing that matter when it comes to the psychological neediness of human beings to want to sort of be with that, like link up with that, whether that means cybernetics or whether that means somebody to be a significant other. There's so many interesting aspects to this, moralistically, values-wise, emotionally, psychologically. I just think it's a really fascinating topic that this episode of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, Android and I, really brings up and really brings to mind. And I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below or as a video response. What gets you thinking about hearing about this, hearing me sort of rambling off the top of my head about this topic? I think it could go any number of ways discussion-wise, and we may end up finding, sooner rather than later, that humankind really has to weigh these moral objectives and the psychological aspects that really fall in line with this thinking. So I'd love to hear from you, and otherwise that'll be it for me on this, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.